Okay, welcome everyone. I hope you can see this first slide of the backup project. It was a European funded project across 9 countries that I will introduce to you. I will also introduce the team to you. Our presentation is a little bit of a tag team. So we've got a few people presenting, so hopefully everything will work well in terms of slide sharing and screen sharing. But just to first of all explain, so this was a call from a couple of years ago from the EU Horizon 2020 programme, focusing on research and innovation action. So very much like a techie digital health type call. We were invited to join this call by the Spanish team from Valencia, who is leading it. We came in quite late in the game, I think about 3 or 4 weeks before the deadline, but it was an initiative that involved 13 different partners across 9 countries in Europe. So very, very excited we were to join, and even more excited when we turned out to be successful. So this is all about spinal pain and back and neck, low back and neck pain in particular. I think most of you guys will know that neck and low back pain is the leading cause for years lived with disability, as has been demonstrated by the Global Burden of Disease projects. So even more of an impact on disability and disability adjusted life years compared to cardiovascular disease and mental health. So it's really high up there, especially because of its high prevalence and its high impact on work and everyday life. The far majority of patients is managed in primary care, especially by GPs and physiotherapists, but also occupational health professionals. And it's a really big, one of the most important reasons for work absence days, sick leave days, and loss of productivity. So a big problem that was recognised by the EU as well. There have been European guidelines on back pain, and there has been a Lancet series of papers that Nadine Foster and Peter Croft contributed to. And they were calling for a number of solutions to try and tackle the impact of back pain globally. Which was first had to do with trying to reduce the enormous variability in decision-making primary care with, depending on the healthcare professional, you might get a different approach to your back pain problem compared to when you consult someone else. Reduce low-value care, especially MRI scans and X-rays, which have reduced enormously maybe in our country, but in other European countries, imaging is still a very regular event for low back pain. And research has shown that actually increases healthcare costs, but also increases the pain and disability associated with back pain compared to not offering so much imaging. And it leads to over medicalization of back pain, which in a sense is a normal part of our lives. I think everyone will experience a number of episodes of back pain in their lives. Not all of it is problematic, but for a proportion of people it will be. So that is why the Lancet series and EU guidelines are very much promoting self-management and patient empowerment. You can deal with your back pain problem to a certain extent, but there is a group of people who go on to develop really chronic, persistent, disabling back problems, and identifying those early and offering them the right type of treatment is important to try and reduce that overall global impact of back pain. So the hypothesis formulated by the EU Backup project was that we can personalise results of information we get from clinical assessments, from prognostic stratification tool, and improve treatment decision making for people with back pain. But that needed evidence-based prognostic risk stratification to identify people at increased risk versus identifying those who will do really well with self-management, and offer people matched interventions. Tailor that self-management to those who can handle back pain themselves. Use and develop and test risk prediction models using state-of-the-art methods. And try and collect new data on a bigger platform to try and validate those models and improve current models of care. So that was sort of like how it was set out at the start of the project in 2018, early in 2018. So the plan was to develop an electronic online platform that clinicians can access and collect data on about their patients, and that patients can access as well to see their self-care plans and to provide data on an ongoing basis for the progress of their health problem or type of treatment they had received. So such a platform would provide assistance for stratified care to clinicians. It would help patients to self-manage and have access to self-management materials, for example, and it would allow clinicians and patients to look at predictions of future pain and disability and work outcomes and see what might be needed to address those risks. The idea was that across the partners there would be lots of resources and lots of sources of data already out there that we can use to build the platform, but that the platform can then be used to collate new data, monitor progression of symptoms and outcomes of treatments, but also embed separate models, for example, to support more advanced rehabilitation of patients, to manage vocational advice for patients. And as we collect the data along the way, update and improve the prediction modeling. Jonathan will talk a little bit more about this later, but it was very much a platform that helps interaction between patients as soon as they contact their first their clinician, their first contact practitioner, which can be a GP or a physio or an occupational health professional. They collate data. Patients collate data as well about how they're doing over time. And they can interact with that platform, and then there will be researchers being able to use that data anonymously for support for research purposes as well. So the structure at the time consisted of 8 work packages, and we won't go through all of them. I just wanted to show you what Keele has been contributing to and the Keele team. We have been doing quite a bit around the prediction modeling and trying to develop models and test models that identify people at high risk and can visualize people's future pain and disability outcomes, and Lucy will talk about that. We have been leading work package 4, which is very much about developing the platform and a stratified model of care, and Jonathan will talk about that. And then, of course, we've been involved in the more general work packages around testing the platform and dissemination. So this is the team. So Jonathan will speak. He's the overall lead and has been driving a lot of it. And I think I'm not exaggerating if Keele has more or less driven a lot of this EU project in the end. Siobhan has been helping with project coordinating and dipping in all sorts of different activities. We had a team working on evidence synthesis and systematic reviews along the way. We've had a statisticians team working on the prediction modelling. We've had a team looking at vocational advice, Gwen and Holly, and we'll talk a little bit about the vocational advice module that was added later on to the project. And we've had a team of people working on the platform itself and the first contact, where Jonathan will talk about and how to test face validity and acceptability of the platform that's at the moment ongoing. So a big team, and I'm sure I've forgotten quite a few people as well, but who've been involved in different phases of the project. So just to give you an overview of the overall project, there have been quite a lot of steps in it, and I'm only presenting the steps that Keele has been contributing to. So the first thing we did at the start of the project in 2018 is do some evidence synthesis and looking at factors that may predict outcomes of pain, disability and work absence in people with neck or back pain. Well, the literature is enormous. So in the end, we decided to do an overview of systematic reviews because there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies available. We then moved on and tried to look at interventions that could be suitable for people with neck and back pain in a primary care setting, but across Europe. And there's a lot of trials available, but the best way to go here seem to be to do a systematic review of European guidelines, because that would allow us to come up with recommendations of treatments for people with neck and back pain that would be acceptable and feasible across Europe. So that was the next step. We then needed to have a think about what are the patient groups that need to be recommended those different types of treatments. So who are the people at increased risk of poor outcome? So that's where Lucy and Kim worked on risk prediction modelling and visualization of risk that would be understandable and accessible for clinicians as well as patients. We use that information around what are the risk profiles of patients, who are the ones at high risks, what are the intervention options for those, to then develop an online platform and an app for first contact practitioners. Jonathan will talk a little bit about that later. We're now at the stage of investigating face validity and acceptability of that platform, which includes mixed methods, interviews, an online survey, stakeholder meetings. And what was added a little bit later in the program of work, I think in 2019, is that we realized that there wasn't really good vocational advice available as part of self-management for patients. So we were tasked with another project of designing a vocational advice service to help people manage their back pain at work and in relation to work, which will be available to people online. So just very briefly, those different phases, starting off with that first evidence review in trying to identify prognostic factors. So we did a systematic review of systematic reviews. And that actually generated quite a lot of hits because there's so much evidence out there. We included 35 reviews at the time. The systematic review was submitted, but we had to update it. So we're now in the process of updating this systematic review. And I think we found another 10 reviews, 15 reviews to add to this overview. But we identified even at the time already about 86 different candidate prognostic factors, and we had to do some weighing of evidence to take a limited number of factors forward for inclusion on the platform for backup. We assessed risk of bias of the systematic reviews to make sure that we ended up with a list of prognostic factors that was evidence-based and supported by high quality evidence. So that review ended up with prognostic factors that we could allocate to 7 domains or categories, and you see the list of domains and categories there in that table underneath evidence synthesis, to do with the severity and intensity of pain, to do with the level of functional limitations in everyday life activities, whether pain was present at multiple signs, level of general health and comorbidity, whether people can cope with their back pain, and the duration of the pain episode. The longer it is, the less likely people were to recover quickly. So we then needed to design a tool that could be used onto the platform, and Keele had already developed a risk stratification tool. And when we started mapping what the evidence showed against the START MSK tool, of course, there was quite a bit of consistency, which was not too surprising because, of course, the START MSK tool Keele developed was based on the evidence. So we then proposed to use the START MSK tool because there was so much development work that had already gone into that for the backup platform. And the EU team agreed to that, but it needed further testing because the START MSK tool, for example, had not been used to predict work outcomes. So then the next step for us was to look at potential treatment options that could be matched to outcomes of the risk stratification tool. And as I mentioned, we did a systematic review of guidelines that have been issued by either EU organisations or national organisations within Europe. We found 17 guidelines that met our eligibility criteria from 8 different countries. We extracted information from those guidelines, including the way they were developed, to make sure we had robust guideline processes informing our treatment selections. We assessed the quality of those guidelines, and about 7 were considered to be of high quality according to the AGREE tool. And we then try to grade the evidence for the treatment options that were proposed for neck and back pain patients across European guidelines. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, but reassuringly, the recommendations were in the end quite consistent around reassurance and self-management support, about the type of advice and education patients can be offered, around return to work and physical activity and use of analgesics, and around the importance of exercise therapies and programs. There were some more specific recommendations for some patient groups, but that was very consistent, and not only across countries, but also across back pain and neck pain, which was helpful to develop a single platform for back and neck pain patients. We had a clinical consensus stakeholder meeting across with input from a number of European countries, and we came up with a list of interventions that is added to the web-based platform Jonathan will talk about. I will hand over to Lucy in a second, but as I said, we started off with the Keele Start MSK tool, but which has been this developed and designed to predict outcomes of pain and disability for a number of musculoskeletal sites. But it needed further development, first of all, because there were no work outcome predictions yet, which we needed for the backup platform. But also the Start MSK tool has been mainly used to stratify between low, medium and high risk. And for backup, we wanted more individual risk predictions, including visualizations, and that needed some further work. So I am going to stop sharing now and hand over to Lucy. So let me make sure I can do that.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm just going to do a quick run through the individualized prediction models that were part of the backup project and the app that Jonathan's going to talk about in a second. So they've gone into the the clinical support app. So first off, I'm going to talk through quickly some of the statistical methods that we used to develop these models. To start off with, we had data to play with from 2 different sources. So the CAP study led by Professor Kate Dunn here at Keele. So that included patients who consulted with their GP with one of any of those 5 most common MSK pain presentations that Daniela just mentioned. So that's back, neck, knee, shoulder and multi-site pain. So they were all invited to take part from 14 general practices. And that was just under 2,000 patients from all of the different body sites. Obviously, in this case, we were just interested in the back and neck patients. We also had data from the TAPS pilot trial led by Jonathan. So that was a 2-armed pilot cluster randomized trial testing the feasibility of that Start MSK tool. So again, it was adults with one of those 5 pain presentations from 8 different GP practices this time. And we went with the Start MSK prediction tool items. So those 10 items that were included in the prediction tool already were the basis for our model development here. So they were the pain intensity, pain self-management, pain impact, whether someone was only able to walk short distances because of their pain, if they had joint or muscle pain in more than one part of their body, whether they thought the condition was likely to last a long time, having other important health problems, their emotional well-being, whether they thought it was unsafe for a person with a condition like theirs to be physically active, and also whether they'd had their current pain problem for more than 6 months. So as I say, they were the basis of our models. We made sure we included those variables in the process. We also added in some other items to help hopefully predict the work absence outcomes more better, basically. We forced pain site into all of those models. So because our data contained patients with both back and neck pain, pain site was introduced as a predictor in the predicted models, as there wasn't enough data in the neck pain patients specifically to build them their own separate prognostic models. So this is a way we kind of accounted for the difference in pain site within the models. We also included health literacy, so how often people needed help when reading instructions, catastrophizing, so that was shown by what the person thought their chances of working normal duties within the next 3 months or so was, also how much pain interfered with their normal work satisfaction, and whether they'd had previous time off work. So there were quite a few models that we developed. So first off, predicting scores. So that's pain scores at 2 and 6 month follow-up, and also the function scores at 2 and 6 month follow-up. So function score was taken from the EQ5D usual activities domain. So trying to predict that the patient's usual activities score at follow-up. They were modelled using multi-level mixed effects linear regression models to account for the fact that we've got data coming from 2 different sources. We also used multi-level mixed effect logistic regression model with no variable selection, so forcing all of those 10 important START MSK tool predictors into the models. So they were to look at just the probabilities of patients experiencing high pain, so that's pain sort of in the top half of the scale at 2 or 6 months follow-up, and also the probability of poor function at 2 and 6 months follow-up. So that was, again, having more severe restriction with their usual activities. In terms of predicting work absence, we also used that logistic regression method, but this time with backwards stepwise selection. So from the 10 START MSK tool items and the additional items I've mentioned, we used some variable selection methods there to predict the probability that someone would require a work absence within 6 months of consultation. We also had breaking work absence down into long or short-term work absence. So that was defined as an absence of less than 4 weeks consecutive being a short-term work absence, or greater than 4 weeks consecutive absence as long-term within the 6 months following consultation. There was some missing data within the data sets, so we conducted multiple imputations separately within the CAPS and TAP studies and then combined them to develop all 10 of those models within the imputed data. We also conducted internal validation, so as I said, we imputed the data and developed the original models, the unadjusted models there. We also bootstrapped from the 2 data sets separately. Within each bootstrap sample, we imputed the data for the CAPS and TAPS trials. We did that 46 times, as that was the minimum fraction of missing cases across those 2 data sets, and developed the model in that in the imputed data from each bootstrap, the apparent performance of the models within that bootstrap sample, and also back in the original imputed data. So then that whole process was repeated with 1,000 different bootstrap samples. So this was to try and give us an idea of how the models might perform in data different, but from the same underlying population to that data used to develop the models in the first place. So from those 1,000 bootstrap samples, we calculated the average optimism, adjusted the original model performance estimates for this optimism, and also calculated the shrinkage of the coefficients for each of the different predictors in the model, and revised the model intercept to allow for the optimism in that in the development process. We adjusted all of the models for the optimism, and they're the final models that then went onto the backup platform and that I'm going to discuss here. So the results, as I say, there's quite a few different models, so bear with me on sort of sample size sorts. Basically, the pain and function models all met the minimum sample size criteria as recommended for linear or logistic prediction models, but the work outcomes, we had relatively little information there compared to the other models, at least. So in the backup data overall, the back and neck pain patients from the TAPS and CAPS studies, we had 769 patients, but of those only 343 were working, so we needed to restrict to that population to be able to predict work absence. And within those, there were only 31 patients who took long-term work absence and 27 who took short-term work absence, so they're relatively small sample sizes for those models. Within the study population, the distributions of the different predictors were reasonably similar, as you might expect, because the TAPS and CAPS studies both recruited from very similar populations. If we look down at the START MSK tool score at baseline, so all of the patients in both of these data sets were assessed using the START MSK tool and assigned into the different risk groups. So we've got high, medium and low risk patients within two groups. The biggest difference really is there were slightly more high risk patients within the CAPS data, but overall the study populations looked quite similar, implying it was reasonable to look at building a model within these two populations together. So for predicting pain, we've got our 4 models there, which are a bit kind of intense. Just focus on the more important predictors. So we've got long-term expectations and pain duration had the largest effects when predicting pain at both time points and in both types of model. So bear in mind, for these ones we were forcing in all of the START MSK tool items, so there was no variable selection in this case, because you might see things like emotional well-being actually have such a small coefficient that they're not in this case adding much to the predictions, because those two were actually the largest effects. Looking at the predictive performance, the calibration of so this is just as an example, the pain at 6 months rather than the 2-month time point, and both the pain score prediction and the probability predictions look like they've got reasonable calibration with quite high calibration slopes, and the C statistic showing reasonable discrimination in the logistic model as well of about 0.8. Predicting function, similarly, we've got long-term expectations and pain duration being sort of the strongest predictors there, but we've also got being able to walk short distances only in this case, which is potentially showing up as it's kind of a proxy for their baseline function levels. Focusing again at the 6-month time point, we've got pretty decent looking calibration still, so high calibration slopes and calibration in the large reasonably close to 0 for both models, and our discrimination in the binary model is looking pretty good still, or again, sorry. In terms of predicting work absence though, so this is where we had the variable selection, so not all of the START MSK items were included, although we did force pain site to stay in the model, so back and neck patients would still be, the differences there would still be accounted for. So the important or the selected variables here were walking short distance only, pain elsewhere, other important health problems, fear of harm, previous absence, and the patient's sort of catastrophizing behaviours, so whether they thought they were likely to be working their usual activities in 3 months' time. The other important health problems actually had a protective effect, which we thought was a particularly interesting outcome. We sort of hypothesized that a few different reasons why this might be, potentially things like and people who have other important health problems already might have coping strategies in place, things like that, but just interesting observation, but they're the variables that were selected for the work absence models. The largest effect though, by quite a long way, was whether or not the patient had had a previous absence, so that's any absence in the 6 months prior to consultation for their pain problem. And as Daniela mentioned, part of what we were looking at was different ways to visualize the probabilities, so particularly for that ordinal model where you've got 2 possible outcomes that you're predicting, the short-term and long-term absences. This is one of the ways that we looked at presenting, so this is one of the ways that have gone onto the app for sort of clinician and patient input on whether they think it's a useful way of presenting the probabilities. Next steps then, so I've discussed the development and internal validation of the models. We've got coming up external validation planned in the TAPS main trial data of the pain and function models, and also some of our European partners are going to look at validating the work absence models and seeing how well they apply in the different populations across Europe. And we've also, as Daniela mentioned, got data collection through the backup app, so some of that data can be used in future validation in the different European populations, and also looking at possibilities of model updating if the models are are slightly too tailored seeming to the UK population and maybe less applicable in some of the other European countries. So that's just my quick sort of whistle-stop tour into the model development. So now Jonathan's gonna go over to, sorry, we're going to go over to Jonathan. He's going to talk through the app, I believe.
I think it's actually going to go back to Daniela shortly to talk about the vocational advice. And then
okay, sorry.
All right.
Yes, so I'll keep this short because I think it's important that Jonathan can talk about the web app, which has been core to this programme. But Gwen and Holly, who was one of our PhD students, were asked to help develop a vocational advice, and work and health is very much the area of expertise of Gwenwyn Jones. And they developed, together with patients, a module that could be offered online to people with neck and back pain that would help them to return to work or to manage their back pain while being in work. So this vocational advice module was based on theory and mostly on the self-efficacy and health action process approach to make sure it was underpinned theoretically as well as by clinical expertise and patient input. We co-designed it with the PPIE group, so people with back and neck pain and experience of working with back and neck pain. And a number of topics were identified as being important to address in a module that would be available to support self-management for people working with back and neck pain, including knowledge about pain and work, considerations at the workplace, pacing of their activity, to have a toolkit of self-management materials, and to be able to think about an action plan as well. And that action plan could include issues related to physical activity, to your emotional well-being, but also, for example, around communicating with your line manager at work and your colleagues at work about the impact of pain on your working life. Here's just a few mock-ups. So there's a welcome page, an introduction to the module. Here is an area around emotional well-being that provides information. But then also links into different resources people can use to help with whether it's anger or distress or concern about their back pain. There's a toolkit that people can use that gives you information around different options you can try and take yourself, take painkillers, things about hot and cold yoga, types of exercises with resources behind that people can use. And they can develop an action plan that they can discuss with their clinician, for example, with their GP or with their physiotherapist over time to see how the module is supporting them in their getting back to work. So I'm just keeping this quick because I want to hand over to Jonathan, but a vocational advice model that we still need to be put online. The content has been developed, but really trying to increase people's self-efficacy to manage their back pain or their neck pain at work and to return to work if they're currently off sick. Okay, I'll stop sharing, Jonathan, so that you can take over.
Okay, so the Backup First Contact decision support tool tries to combine all of the stuff that we've been hearing about so far into a web app. The vocational advice module is slightly separate, but is signposted. It's something that is signposted within the web app so that patients could then go and do that in their own time. The web app itself is designed for clinicians, and I'll just talk you through. What I'm going to do is give you a few slides, and then I'm going to actually be brave and try and demonstrate it to you, which is always a bit tricky with technology. So what we were doing was trying to say, well, when clinicians have a patient with back and neck pain in that first sort of contact consultation, we know they've got a lot of tasks to do and they've got some treatments to choose from, and how can we support them in making the right decision and doing that. But there's some real challenges to clinicians, particularly when it comes to completing tools. StartBack, we've learnt a lot about that, and algorithms. Clinicians don't tend to want to do that. And if you're going to try and get better consistency, reduce low value care, you've got to do it in a way that really adds value to the consultation and it isn't seen as a huge burden. So that was the challenge to us. And what we've been trying to do is to put together then a platform that's a demonstrator that allows us to sort of show the concept, but then iteratively try and improve that. Very much very conscious that this is our sort of first attempt and it's not going to be the final sort of product by any means. This is just a very early stage. One of the things we did try to put into the web app was some comparison feedback, so that you could see what peers, other clinicians were doing in their first contact decision making, because that would help you perhaps change some of your behaviours if you were out of line. And one of the things we know is that these sorts of processes have to be adapted for specific contexts and they have to be integrated. Unfortunately, backup just can't be integrated into systems across the whole of Europe. That was beyond the life of a 3-year project. But what we have done here is to try and get a demonstrator that's standalone, that in the future can be fairly easily integrated through the way that we've coded it and the way that we understand the inputs required and the outputs required to do that. So I'm going to demonstrate to you the professional platform, but just to let you know, we've designed the sort of the back-end database of backup to allow us to do research, as you've heard, and there is also a self-management platform for patients within the backup wider EU team that's being headed by the Norwegians who run the SelfBack project. So let's go and have a look at it, and I'll do my best to try and demonstrate this to you. Oh, now with a pen, it's not going to allow me to do that. Let me just take that off and click on here, and hopefully that's going to take you to where you can see the backup. I'll put this website address in the chat so that you can go and have a look at it. I'm actually going to log on. I've got open this with my wife's email address and here with my own, just so that I can show you people at different stages, because initially a clinician would be at stage 1 as part of our face validity testing, and then as they go through and give us feedback on the first stage, then they unlock stage 2. So when you first start using this, you don't get Lucy's lovely individual predictions. It takes you straight through to treatment options and selecting self-management and producing a care plan, a personalised care plan for patients. So I'll just quickly show you that. So first we need to say whether it's back or neck pain and ensure that they've not got any serious pathology. Now this has jumped me through to the match treatment options, so that it's not so complicated for clinicians to do that. So I can choose some self-management resources for a patient. There's a set of default resources that go with back pain. If I said neck pain earlier, I would have had a set of neck pain resources, but you can go into and unselect some of those resources, and you can choose maybe a medication resource or I don't know, whatever else you would think was appropriate for the patient in front of you. And when you've selected those, oh, it's disappeared, that will then appear within the green box. And that's what the patient will see. And I can just flick through some of these other recommended treatments if I want to give them maybe some physical activity. This particular website that I've put here will give you the CSP, or I can set another website here, maybe Strava or something that I particularly like for this patient. I can set, and that will then appear for the patient to see on their care plan. So we can choose from weight reduction, community forums. I'm going to select a few of these and then you'll see that, and maybe pain medication. And you can go through and you can see that at the moment none of these treatments are matched to risk profile, because at this stage I'm just getting clinicians used to using the tool and seeing the options. I'm just going to randomly click a few options, save those. And then just before we share them with the patient, there's a reassurance statement, and you can have a low to high level of reassurance. There's when should the patient next come and see you? Typically, perhaps only if their symptoms get worse. There's an option to remove the prediction graphs, which will become apparent why that's appropriate when we reach phase 2. And then lastly, I can then decide if I want to have a PDF or do I want to email this to the patient. Now, hopefully that, I'm going to jump through and I'll show you how that looks in phase 2. But you can see that there's feedback. Once you get through 5 patients, and they can happily be fictitious, the way we're collecting feedback is before you're allowed to unlock another stage, we're getting clinicians then to give us some feedback around how they think it will help their decision making. Do they think it'd be clear and easy for patients to understand? Does it improve shared decision making and clinical decision making with the patients? And what ideas might they have? So if you submit that, that will then allow you, oh, it's not going to let me because I've not answered all the questions. It should then allow me to submit and unlock then stage 2, where I can go on and look now at the exciting stage of Lucy's predictions. So here I'm just doing exactly the same eligibility page, but now I've got the Start MSK tool. So I'm just going to randomly quickly just say yes to every question. You've seen these and the 2 work questions. And now what we get in addition to low, medium and high is we have individual predictions for pain, function, and tucked away so that the patient doesn't see these are predictions for work absence. So this person has a 34% chance of some work absence over the next 6 months, and you can see how that splits between short and long term. The other thing that you can do is you can see, well, what's the relationship between some of the predictors and how this individual is going to do over the next 2 and 6 months. I'd love to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. We do have the data, we just haven't had the time to analyse that. And another thing to say is that the Norwegian group are preparing prediction graphs like this for patients with step count, again using the same set of predictors, so that it will give you a sense of how to target for each month how many steps a patient should be doing, which would be helpful. But you can see that as I might reduce someone's pain, we can see, well, that helps, but not particularly in the longer term. We have to address some of the other characteristics here. And as you go down them, you'd see which ones particularly have an impact on an individual's predicted outcome. And now when I click on the match treatments, I'm through to the one I previously showed you. But now, because they're a medium risk patient, I've not got the high risk options. If I was to go back and make it a low risk patient, you'd only get the first 5 treatment options. So lastly, let me just show you, I'm only going to just trick self-management here and save that. And I'm just going to quickly go through. So what you can do on the last page now is decide to send this to the patient. So if I put my own email address in here, j.hill@Keele, hopefully I will get now this care plan through to my emails. It should come in, oh, there we go. And I can click on the link in there, and that will give me, as a patient, it could give me then my care plan, who I saw, the level of concern, so that's the reassurance statements here. What were my predictions? We agreed that I was going to look at some information. If I'd put down that the clinician was going to do a referral, you'd see that here. And then at the very end of here, what we're asking patients to do is to give us some feedback about what they think about this personalised care plan. And if you click here, then it's fully anonymous. The patient can then add some feedback to submit, and then we'll be able to collect that data. So do have a look at it. As a clinician, I would love to have people's feedback. There are a few additional things. You can have a look at your statistics, your user statistics, and you can see your patients. It's not letting me do it just yet because I'm not on phase 3 with this particular demonstration, but if you're in stage 3, and also what we've got is it's available across a whole range of languages, so we can change across, there's going to be 13 languages working, where we can change all of the details across the whole app and even the feedback forms. So I'm just going to flick back to the presentation just to finish to say what we're at the stage what we're at is clinical testing, getting clinicians to give us some feedback via this sort of integrated feedback forms, also getting patients to give us some feedback, and then doing some qualitative interviews as well. And we're hoping then to just be able to have a second round of iterative changes, really, that assimilates all of that feedback and helps us work out what are the really helpful and useful bits within here that clinicians are finding useful. Already the feedback we're getting is that some clinicians would prefer it to be more modular, so that they could choose just, for example, the self-management resources, or they could add the prediction piece just separately. And we'll just have to see where that develops in the future. But it's certainly exciting to be able to test it across so many countries and to be able to get feedback not only in the UK but across France and Germany, etc., on how clinicians are finding it. Now, how we're doing for time, I think we'll be running out, so I'm going to stop sharing, and hopefully we can take some questions that are coming to us via the channel. So if you've got some questions, do put those down in the Q&A and we can go through those. So, question from Richard. I can see in the Q&A. Richard, thank you. You said great work packages and interactive tools. My question is whether it's sensible to be taking prognostic factors and prognostic models and then assuming that we can modify risk by changing levels of these factors. In other words, taking prognostic factors and assuming they are causal and that modifying them will change risk. And I think this is a big leap. Well, thank you, Richard. Who wants to have a go at that? Well, I might have a start of that. And I think you're right, Richard, that we've got to be careful that we don't say that these are definitely mediators. We have done some work around with StartBack looking at mediators, particularly for higher risk patients. But I guess it's not, the value of having the predictions isn't only around the fact that they become treatment targets. The value is also around setting expectations. The value is about being able to have a clear plan in a shared decision-making format where a clinical course is clear and can be explained. But you're right, if we mustn't overdo the fact that these are causal, and we mustn't expect people to think of them like that. On the other hand, I think they are useful, and some of these things clearly are important, and they are things that we should be trying to help, whether it be someone's expectations, someone's fears, someone's concerns, and seeking to try and particularly focus treatments on things that we know to be predictive makes intuitive sense. But what we're going to need to do, I guess, in the future is test that. And I think your question is right, to raise that as something we've just got to be thoughtful about. Daniela, Lucy, anything to add to that?
No, I think you're right, Jonathan. I mean, for this particular population and for this setting, we haven't investigated yet whether reducing fear will improve outcomes, but there is such a large body of evidence already. I mean, at Keele, we've looked particularly at some of the mediating factors, but there's lots of trials looking at interventions to reduce fear avoidance, interventions to improve mood, interventions to address comorbidity. So I think we're comfortable enough to make those recommendations, but of course there's no guarantees. Yeah.
Have we got any other questions? Do put them on the Q&A, and we will do our best. I'm sorry we presented quite so much to you, but it's been a lot happening. I didn't show you under the vocational advice. One of the things that Lucy's got when you get the work predictions, although the patients can't see, there's a strength of recommendation for a vocational advice treatment. And that allows us, particularly where someone's at high risk of having time off work, to flag up to clinicians that the fact that it should be important that they do refer them. I've already had a clinician come back to me and said, you've got it on the wrong page. You've got it on your clinical predictions page and it should be on your treatment selection page, which is a really useful comment. And it's that sort of thing that we need clinicians to be helping us with, so that we can transfer the prognostic information that we're able to visualize into ways that are really useful for clinicians as they're considering treatment. And that's one of the examples where we can flag that someone's at risk of having time off work, and therefore we can encourage the clinician to consider signposting someone to do Gwen's vocational advice module. So just, yeah, 1 point. So we've had a few more questions. So Lucy, do you mind reading those for me while I gather my thoughts?
Can do. So the first one from Jan, would it be useful to also show the uncertainty around the predictions? So that's something we've had quite a lot of debate about within the team. Basically, we're pushing to avoid that. So in prediction modelling, generally having an uncertainty around the final prediction isn't best practice. We try and avoid that if possible, because the sort of confidence intervals around it are a bit meaningless, really. So it'd almost be sort of showing them for the sake of it. So we have had quite a few discussions around the best way to show that is just a prediction, and that it does come with some uncertainty without actually plotting a region on the graph. I'm not sure, is it at the moment, Jonathan, just a statement underneath to say these have been generated from patients with similar
That's right, and there's when you go in and look at the sort of in more depth, which I only showed you for work, I think, just now. I didn't go and show you the pain and disability more in-depth visualizations, but then it explains that this is based on previous patients and who have responded in similar ways to the questionnaire. And you're right, there's a sense among lots of clinicians about what's the uncertainty around these estimates. And you know, at the moment, what the sense is best practice for how we present these isn't with that kind of uncertainty. And if you look at some of the other big risk models that are available, like the QRisk or breast screening, that you'll find that it's very similar to the way that we've presented it. One thing I would say that I think reassures a lot of people, we've got, I'll give you an example. There's an MSc student at Keele who's doing a specific sub-study on backup, testing it within the military. And of course, in the future, you could imagine that their estimates of predictions would look quite different from our graphs taken from general practice, patients. And because of the way backup is set up, we have the opportunity to collect some prospective data, and then we're building this thing called automated retraining of our models, which would allow Lucy at the click of a button to update those prediction estimates. So that's the plan, so that as data, for example, from the military came in, we could look again to see how much we need to recalibrate those existing models. So I think that's in some way reassuring that we've got that built into this. But I agree that at the moment, the way that we've done it, a lot of clinicians feel uncertain because they're not familiar with this kind of visualization. So it's something we've got to get past.
There's a question from Claire Jinks about the has there been a particular intervention development approach underlying the design of the web app?
And certainly for Gwen's new vocational advice, she's been very clear about her theoretical model and her approach. When it's come to the web app, I think what we've taken there is much more of a sort of digital health development approach, where we've tried to involve users. We're trying to be clear about. I feel like we're such at the early stage that I wouldn't want to yet elevate it to the state of as an intervention player. What we're trying to do, I think, is pull together conceptually the fact that we can do visualizations and we can present it in a way that clinicians then tell us, well, this is the way we would find useful for our decision making. I'm not sure we can quite say we're all ready for that yet, but this is part of the research to get users to tell us how useful they find those visualizations for their decision making, and patients as well to tell us, because we've tried to add value by making it easy to do the match treatments, easy to select things like self-management resources, and to provide a care plan for a patient so they can take something away with them. So there's a lot to it, and what we want to do, I guess, is build from that and get lots of feedback and slowly grow it. But we haven't taken a particular approach or framework, I think, to that, partly perhaps because we've not seen it as an intervention particularly as we've done it up to now. And there's one more question, I think, from Kate, and then we probably ought to finish. Shall I read that? Do you think that showing the patients the visualizations will change beliefs or behavior? I think that's a great question. We don't know, do we? Certainly a lot of the early clinical feedback from clinicians who are using this feel that it does help with setting expectations, a bit like STARD MSK, just knowing low, medium or high. But I'm hoping that there's some added value from actually being able to see predictions for pain, function, work, and for things like step count, helping with exercise, prescription, etc. So let's see, Kate. I don't think we've got the answers to that question yet.
No, I think you're right. And just while I was reading that question, I was thinking about other areas as well, isn't it? In cardiovascular disease and smoking. And I think showing people's heart age or showing their lung age if they're smoking, and then demonstrating that if you reduce some of their risk, you might actually improve it. Who knows, it might help for people to take action and become more active. Or yeah, my main initial concern was that if you just see that your pain scores are going to be equally as high in 6 months' time, you get depressed and catastrophize. But it may not be. If people can see, they might be able to do something about it. But yeah, that's a research question in itself, isn't it?
I'm conscious of time, so we probably ought to draw a line there. But thank you to everyone who's contributed. Thank you to Daniela and Lucy for supporting me in presenting today. It's been really helpful. And I hope you those of you who are listening, find it interesting and valuable. So many thanks all. Cheers.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye. Bye.